So it's my pleasure to my far left to introduce Kate Pastor, who is a descendant of Rose Pastor Stokes, the only one of us who can claim any lineal connection to our personalities, and the legendary Joyce Mendelson, author of The Lower East Side, Remembered and Revisited, and founder of the Friends of the Lower East Side, one of the most critical preservation organizations now trying to save the Lower East Side from those who would erase all of our built history in that community. Dr. Alyssa Sampson is here, and before she achieved her doctorate was anyway known to all of us as the preeminent scholar and community historian on all things Lower East Side. And we will begin with her.
If you're wondering, I am Clara Lemma, which means the next slide is going to appear mysteriously. Da-da-da-da-da.
There it is.
Aha. Okay, Ms. Lemla, as you may have noticed upon coming in here, particularly with the delayed entrance, is up on the wall. Ms. Lemla is featured in the mural here, and she's next to Zora Neale Hurston and Isaac Hoppe. I can tell you, historically, she did not know either of them. It would have been very anachronistic. However, they're all from the neighborhood in some very broad sense of the word. And Clara Lemla is sitting there with her sewing machine because she was the leader of the uprising of 20,000. Now that uprising was relatively successful, but it gives you an idea of just how uphill it went when their motto was better to die fast than starve slow. That is not a good sign the first day of the strike. All right? So we're going to talk a little bit about Clara Lemma, and I'm going to try to contextualize her and the times that she lived in, because all of the ladies that are going to be represented tonight are part of that same period of history, and each has a very different take as an agitator and an activist. So, next please. Okay, Clara Lemla basically immigrates to the United States in 1905. When I try to explain to people about push-pull migration, she's a great example. Her family had been wealthy in the Pale of Settlement in the Ukraine. They lost some money, so immigration was more attractive. And they lived one town over from Kishinev. Does anybody recognize the name of that shtetl? No. Okay, what's Kishinev?
It's the place where there was a pogrom in 1903.
Exactly. Within a month, the oldest boy and girl from the family gets sent on the boat and told, work your tush off and bring the rest of the family, and they come by 1905. So there are a bunch of younger siblings. She's the next oldest girl. She gets to work, and she has to give all her savings to her family, meaning she gets no savings. There are a bunch of younger kids that get to go to school. One of the older boys gets to work and save his money so they can go to college and law school. She resents that. She also comes from a family, again, that had some wealth and had what's called yichus. In other words, they had some sort of pedigree within that world of the Ukraine in terms of rabbinic family. So Clara Lemma goes from a very sort of cushioned life in which she had books smuggled to her in Russian. She's a native speaker of Yiddish, and those books were by people that were not read in religious families, people like Tolstoy. Okay, so you can see she's starting to get radicalized a bit as a teenager in Russia and Ukraine. She actually wants to go to Palestine and rescue the world. But then her family immigrates after Kishinev. She comes to the Lower East Side and she finds herself working in sweatshops. It is not fun.
Alyssa, 3 minutes.
Okay. What Miss Lemla finds herself doing before that strike in 1909, which happens on November 22nd at Cooper Union, okay, is organizing Local 25 of the ILGWU. Now, there are already 20 odd years of organizing in terms of the needle of the garment trades. They're relatively unsuccessful, meaning you get a strike, you get a union, you get a strike, you get a union, nothing stays together. Gompers, Samuel Gompers, at that point is the head of the AFL, and Benjamin Feigelbaum is the head of the ILGWU. In 1906, they already are founding Local 25 with Clara Lemlock as one of the founders. And she has a fairly good idea that they need strikes to be able to improve working conditions. Now, in terms of this meeting, I'm going to tell you that when Clara Lemlock speaks, and I'm going to read to you some of her quotes, they had a total of $4 in Local 25's treasury. Okay? You think of what it takes to sustain a strike, $4 is not going to do it. Okay. So, tired of long speeches urging caution and worried that both momentum and support was being lost, Lemlock recounted in Yiddish the intolerable conditions in the shops and called for a general strike. In other words, she just shut up Gompers, who was on the podium and trying to tell people, calm down. The response was immediate and affirmative. I am one of those who suffers from the abuses described here, and I move we go on a general strike. Lemlock's words and passion stirred the crowd. The chairman of the event came to his side and called out, will you take the old Hebrew oath? Though not an exclusively Jewish gathering, most in the crowd raised their right arms and pledged with him in Yiddish. If I turn traitor to the cause, I now pledge, may my right arm wither from the arm I now raise, may my tongue forget speech. That's the Union version in 1909 of Psalm 137. And so began the uprising of 1909. These are some of the strikers. Next slide. They're very fast. These are the strikers who are older and they're going and marching on City Hall. Next. This is the funeral cortege of the Triangle Fire. Clara, and the reason I'm doing this here, rather than a more graphic photo, is because Clara Lemlock, and that's 13-week strike, targeted the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory because it was considered the most abusive of the large employers. They were the sweatshop camps. And 70% of all the garment trade, the women's garment trade, settled with the strikers after 13 weeks, but the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, and this is a shirtwaist for those of you unfamiliar with the garment, right, did not settle. And so the conditions in 1911 and March 25th, and the anniversary that's coming up, are directly associated and fingered with this strike in 1909, and Clara Lemlock is given credit by historians and also in her day for having pointed out the issues with that factory and with that industry. Thank you.
It's my pleasure to call on Joyce Mendelson to enlighten us about Lillian Wald.
Lillian Wald.
Joyce, use the microphone.
No, I don't think so.
Is everyone's good? Okay.
Go like this in the back if you can't hear me, okay?
We're good?
Okay? Yeah. Okay. Lillian Wald, feminist, social reformer, founder of Henry Street Settlement and the Visiting Nurse Service. Born 1867 into a German Jewish family in Rochester, New York. More German than Jewish. Rochester, New York, the site of the women's liberation movement and of the local Indian tribe matriarchy. The Jewish community in Rochester, New York had a solid core focused on universalism with rights to everybody, regardless of race, color, or creed. They were totally involved in the ethical culture movement, which was Felix Adler's movement for good deeds. And it was from this milieu that Lillian Wald was raised, in an affluent family. She had every opportunity for culture, friendship, love of family, and so forth. But she was restless. She had to do something on her own. She had to accomplish something. And she decided to go into nursing. Nursing meant power. Nursing meant female power and the ability to become not just a healer, but also an organized person, a person who could run an institution and so forth. And as a nurse, she came down to the Lower East Side to volunteer at a tiny little site which had been set up by the ladies of the Uptown Temple Emmanuel. And as she was teaching them homemaking skills, a little kid comes running in and says, "You have to come, my mother, my mother, my mother." So Lillian Wald follows her, goes up the 6 flights of stairs in an unspeakable tenement, finds a woman hemorrhaging on the bed. It's a two bedrooms, we should live so long, a 2-room tenement apartment where 7 people lived, including 2 boarders. So Lillian Wald takes care of the woman, attends to her patient, runs downstairs, comes up with food, scrubs the floor, says, "I'll be back tomorrow." The woman, Mrs. Lipsky, kisses her hand, and at that moment, Lillian Wald knows what her path is. She's going to come down to the Lower East Side, and she's going to start a home nursing service there. So, but she needs money. How is she going to function? She goes to Jacob Schiff and Betty Lowe, who have been financing some charities on the Lower East Side, and they decide that they are going to help her and give her money. And Jacob Schiff becomes her primary source of finance for the entire settlement. He buys 265 Henry Street for her, a little federal house, and she moves in and with a group of nurses, and they begin home nursing services. The nurses live in the settlement. It was called the Nurses Settlement. But Lillian Wald also had clubs for kids and teams and a playground in the backyard. And one day, Ernie comes up and says, Miss Wald, you have to change the name because when my team goes to play soccer, they make fun of us. They say, here comes the Noises, here comes the Noises. So it became Henry Street Settlement. Henry, on the land of Henry Rutgers, his huge farm. That's where we get Henry from. So the settlement continues. Nurses are living at the settlement. Nurses are coming and working, and in different districts throughout the city. And Lillian Wald realizes that it's not enough just to take care of a sick person. You have to go back to the root of where does this person live, where does she or he works, what are the issues. And so Lillian Wald becomes a spokesperson for improved housing, labor legislation, education, you name it, every social solution to a problem. And that, when Lillian Wald retired in 1933, a social worker took over Henry Street Settlement, and at that point, the settlement and the visiting nurse service separated. So we have, today, you have the visiting nurse service, right? Everybody knows that. That's Lillian Wald's contribution among all of her. We'll go back to, in the questions of her pacifism, her labor attitudes, and everything else.
Thank you. And please.
So Rose Pastor Stokes, who is my relative, but she didn't have any children, so I'm not really directly a descendant of hers, but I am her, sort of, I guess I'm her descendant, but not in the direct line. She was actually born in Poland, what today's Poland was Russia, and a lot of who she became, which was a socialist and communist and also a feminist, I would argue, had to do with her personal experiences, especially early in life. She was one of several, so she was born as the only child of her mother. Her father died, and she moved with her mother to London, where she lived on the East End in a slum, and her mother remarried, a man named Jacob by the name of Israel Pastor. And once she got to the US, she moved to Cleveland, where I guess 2 days after they got there, she ended up working in a cigar factory. So it wasn't exactly the American dream that everybody had hoped for. She continued to work as a child laborer. She was 11, I believe, for about 11 years after that. But she, I suppose, her mother was involved in union, in labor issues, and had been involved in a strike when she was on the East End, which I believe did sort of radicalize her to some extent. But she, somewhat on her own, just started writing into newspapers and writing letters to the editor, and ended up becoming a sort of regular contributor to the Jewish Daily News while she was also working in a cigar factory in Cleveland. And she would do this at night when she would get home from the factory, which is something she eventually had to stop, but she'd established enough of a relationship with the newspaper that she was asked to come to New York for a job. It turned out, I mean, it was, it sounds like a little bit of a mixed scenario, because she was sort of having an affair or a romantic sort of relationship with the editor, and she got to New York and found out that he was sort of having a romantic relationship with everyone, especially his fiance. But that's sort of what brought her here, and then she very quickly got involved in some of the settlement work in the same area as the Jewish Daily News, which involved teaching. She tutored girls at the Educational Alliance, and then sort of by popular demand stayed on after her substitute position sort of ended. And she was doing that. She was also writing this Dear Zelda column, which was sort of advice to young Jewish ladies about the proper way to behave yourself, especially with men. And working in the settlement, and that's when she met the man that made her famous, which was Bram Phelps Stokes, who was from a very wealthy family in New York, and he was involved in settlement work. So she went, and she was not only working in the settlement, but she was also sent to go out and interview the somewhat famous and rich settlement worker, and that's how she met Bram Phelps Stokes. And she'd actually, before that, had interviewed Lillian Wald, I believe. That was sort of where she got introduced to the settlement movement. But they ended up meeting and working in the settlement movement for a while, and then sort of moving on to other causes. She was, she was involved in labor. She was also involved in birth control. She was involved in, she was a writer. She was also a lot of things that people don't know about her. She was also a singer. She wrote a number of different plays. She was a poet. She just had a lot of interests. So somehow she was gonna probably not just work in the factory. So just to read one little excerpt that I think sort of more than anything, sort of explains where the sort of intersection of feminism and socialism was for her. This is from her unfinished autobiography. I slipped into the world while my mother was on her knees scrubbing the floor. It was on July 18, 1879. Hindle the straw girl, they called my mother. She was so fair-skinned and straight and so slender. She was married off at 17. Her father, Burl the fisherman, was pleased with the attention paid her by Jacob the Lorne bootmaker, but Hindle didn't love Jacob. She secretly adored a young Pole who was madly in love with her, but filial piety was strong in the heart of young Hindle. She could not wound her old father. Besides, daughters did not marry. They were married off, and her father was determined upon her marriage with Jacob. When Jacob came courting her, she smudged her face and hands and put on a soiled gown. But Jacob, the Lorne bootmaker, was not to be discouraged. So she really just came out of, I think, seeing her mother be sort of hemmed in by being a mother of 7 children, very poor, and the restrictions that women had at that time. And everything in her life beyond that point seems to sort of point back to this period.
Thank you. Okay. You want to... Okay. You'd all please give Alyssa your attention again. We're going to hear about Emma Goldman.
I have to shift hats, so to speak. I still get to wear a shirtwaist because Emma Goldman was a young woman who lived in Kovno, which is Lithuania, and also was in the Russian Pale settlement. And also she got to basically immigrate when her family did. She also taught herself surreptitiously Russian. And when she ended up in Rochester, that hotbed that we've heard about, she ended up basically as a garment trade worker and did not find that particularly edifying. But Emma Goldman was known as the most dangerous woman in America. She was an anarchist. Clara Lemla was a socialist who became a communist, much like Rose Pastor Stokes. Goldman became an anarchist fairly fast. She heard somebody speak in Rochester. And within a year of being in Rochester, the Haymarket riots and the martyrs had been killed. So in 1888, she's already warning what happens in Haymarket in the USA without really knowing much about anarchism at all. Goes down to New York, leaves her husband, decides that she's going to get divorced, and wanders around the Lower East Side looking for an anarchist speaker that she had heard in Rochester. Eventually, against all odds, she finds him. He takes her to a cafe, called Café Zap, on Suffolk Street, and she meets there Sasha Bergman, or Alexander Bergman. And that is basically the passion of a lifetime. And I don't mean that simply in a romantic sense, I mean in the sense of intellectual camaraderie and other things. If we go to the next slide, we can see what happens to a more mature Emma Goldman, right? And here you can see that if I could have done the bun pitching on, I would have. But if we go to one more slide, you're going to get a sense of Emma Goldman as she moves through the Lower East Side. By 1901, McKinley is assassinated, and he's the president, for those of you who don't recognize the name. And he is assassinated by an anarchist. She had nothing to do with it. However, Goldman does get blamed for that. And in part because when she was hanging out with Sasha, Sasha had gone for Henry Frick. Henry Frick, as in the Frick Mansion and Museum. And one of the things that Sasha did is basically aim at him point blank and actually not kill him. You know, they're anarchists and they're anarchists.
Jewish boys with guns.
And now Sasha was very determined. However, he did spend quality time in a federal institution. And while Lemlich had been arrested 17 times before the strike of 1909, I have to tell you, Emma Goldman's going to set a world record compared to Lemlich. Because she got to spend time because of the Frick stuff, she got to spend time because of McKinley, which she had nothing to do with. And then this goes on after 1901, and by the time you start hitting some of her activities, it will give you a sense of why Emma Goldman is just so popular with a variety of federal authorities and local ones. Okay, what I did is actually I took a month in the life of Emma Goldman in 1911 on her Yiddish and English family planning, Yiddish theater, and political lecture circuit,
Just 3 minutes.
just in the neighborhood, okay? She gave a series of Sunday afternoons and evening lectures in the neighborhood, and the topics included marriage and the lot of children among the poor, government by spies, art and revolution, communism, the most practical basis for society, Mary Wollstonecraft, the pioneer of modern womanhood, good taste, and socialism caught in its political trap. We're at a time in which anarchism, communism, and socialism were not well defined. She is what's called a communist anarchist or an anarcho-syndicalist, so these words are still sort of slippery at that point. Because of her lectures at that time on birth control and Yiddish theater, which she wanted social realism, she got arrested. So she was in prison for inciting to riot and illegally distributing information about birth control. World War I was the watershed for her in America. We have the Espionage Act in 1917, and by 1918 we have the Sedition Act. She is against the war, like all of these women. And because she's against the war and speaks out, she spends another 2 quality years doing federal time. This is actually the previous slide shows you when she's living, actually she's moved from First Street and Market Street. She's now managed to get to 208 East 13th Street and become the publisher along with her friend Sasha of Mother Apes. Next slide shows you a cartoon in which Teddy Roosevelt, who's the police chief of New York City, is trying to shut her up. She's holding a graga. Purim's coming up as a holiday. What does a graga do? Makes noise. She's the noise maker. Next slide. Okay, she's in Union Square agitating in 1916. This is the sort of thing that gets the feds very upset. Next slide. Okay, this is what they do in 1917 once you have the Sedition Act. Okay, they lock her up, and that says in Yiddish prison. They just basically, capitalism is locking her away. Next, this is 1960 rather. Now, this is Emma Goldman as an older woman. We have Sacco and Vanzetti, right, who get killed in 1927. We have Catalonia, which is the most important part of her life because there she gets to see anarchism, from her point of view, communal anarchism, succeed. Unfortunately, Franco really won that war, but she is very much honored by the anarchist movement of Catalonia and becomes their English language spokesperson, moves to London, edits their publications, and then eventually moves to Canada in '39 when that war is over.
Okay.
She's buried in Haymarket with the rioters, or the anarchists if you prefer, that she valued so much.
We will open it up to questions. Please.
Yeah, the anarchist that Emma Goldman married in Union Square, is that Johann Most?
Johann Most was arguably one of the 2 most famous German-speaking anarchists in the Lower East Side, when the Lower East Side was really actually Kleindeutschland. And Johann Most was an advocate, among other things, of violence, which is where Sasha and Plot brought that ideology as well as from Russia. So she was very affected by Johann Most, but by 1916 she had broken with him a long time ago. At one point she actually horsewhipped him.
I have a question. What's the connection between Lillian Wald and Emma Goldman?
So Emma Goldman had to earn a living, and having people pay 1 to 3 pennies or listen to a lecture for free on social realism and Yiddish theater, or whatever it was that took her fancy at that moment, was really not a good way to earn a living. So she earned a living as a night nurse, what we would call a practical nurse, and as a midwife. Very few people, given Emma Goldman's politics, were willing to give her employment, let alone a steady wage. Lillian Wald was one of the few, and gets a lot of credit for that.
Please, gentleman here with the.
Kate, how did Rose end up in jail, and how long was she in jail?
She didn't end up in jail.
Oh, was
She was convicted
she was convicted?
under the
but she didn't serve-
Espionage Act, but she ended up not serving that.
Oh.
Her husband, she married a rich guy,
Right.
so that would bail her out.
Right.
She had an
She never
excellent
served
lawyer.
time, Okay.
A rich, well-connected guy. There was another question?
Yeah, I wanted to know about Rose Pastor Stokes, given that your family connection, what, some of the stories that you heard about her growing up, and how was she sort of communicated to you as either a role model or a controversial figure, or what were some of the images that were passed down to you about her through the family?
Oddly, it probably had less to do with her particular ideology or viewpoint, and more like, you know, just having a somewhat famous person in her family. So just that she was, and that people might know her. But then also, my dad used to talk about how my grandfather, who was the only relative that I know that knew her, would talk about how he influenced her. Sorry, she influenced him, sitting around, I guess, you know, family residence or something like that, and there could be a lot of intellectual discussions, and that he got a lot from it, and he became very politically active, and that certainly has had some kind of influence on just my, you know, viewpoint of the world, and certainly my dad's. So I think more through my grandfather, but I don't know, what would, yeah, no, I think just that she's been
Was she held up,
arrested.
was she held up more for, like, of all the different things she did? She was a journalist, she was all of those other things that you talked about, but she was a very active socialist and communist, but then she was also very active early on in women's rights,
Right.
suffrage, birth control. Which of those things sort of was more the legacy that was passed on?
Right, well, I didn't know, I mean, I always knew that she was involved in sort of feminist issues, but this has been an opportunity to really dig into that for me. I never heard that much about that. Although it's not surprising or new to me, I think that, yeah, it was more about her socialism that I knew about as a kid. And there's also this beautiful picture of, it's like woman with child, it's sort of a sketch outline that's in my parents'
Yeah, she was an
house.
artist.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so that doesn't really, you know, it was just this beautiful piece of art made by a relative, and I didn't associate it with anything really. But now I do.
Thank you. Question over here?
How did Lillian Wald become involved in becoming a nurse? Because I thought at that time, a lot of the nurses were nuns.
Lillian Wald enrolled in the New York Hospital School of Nursing, which was on Fifth Avenue and 50th Street. And that was a school of nursing that was non-sectarian. And that's where she got her training. When she graduated, she decided she worked for a year in a hospital, and she hated it, absolutely hated it, because it was so regimented. And so she decided she'd go to medical school. But incident with the child on the Lower East Side, which brought her into the slums, changed the trajectory of her life.
Was she one of the first Jews to become a nurse?
No, there were other Jewish students there, but she didn't, she and her family considered themselves more German than Jewish. There was a synagogue, a German Jewish synagogue in Rochester. Her family belonged to it, but showed up once a year. And her parents are buried in the cemetery of that synagogue.
I have some questions. Picking up on what Joyce was just saying about the Jewish connection within the Wald family, do we see anything thematic in terms of the trajectory of these women's values and activities and so on? Do we see any evidence of their Jewish identity in what they chose to pursue and how they went about it? Alyssa?
I'd argue that for both Goldman and Lemlich, in very different ways, they were grappling with the questions of universalism and being Jewish. Because being Jewish in their time, especially with Yiddish as a native language, was a marked identity. There wasn't anybody who didn't know, including J. Edgar Hoover, when he kicked her out of the country in 1919, that she was Jewish. So I went back to look at her writing called My Disillusionment with Russia. She was not a big fan of Lenin's, though she had welcomed the Bolshevik Revolution. What she wrote in it, basically, was a description of the pogroms in the Ukraine between 1919 and 1921, particularly in Moscow. She also wrote a description of Bialik, Nachum Bialik, who was a famous Yiddish and Hebrew poet. And most movingly for me, what she wrote was being in Kiev and listening to a recital of Yudlam Peretz's poetry by the Jewish Cultural Liga, who worked with children who had survived pogroms. And what she wrote was, at the literary evening, Peretz's poem, The Four Seasons, was by recitative group singing. The effect was striking. All were made vivid and alive by this new form of collective recital. So Goldman was a universalist of something that people used to call the Jewish question, but she wasn't ashamed of being Jewish, and she spoke in Yiddish all the time. Lemlich was a little different. Lemlich was a communist eventually, and Yiddish really remains a native tongue. Unlike Goldman, she can't go do the German and the English very easily. So she ends up organizing immigrant women, particularly after she gets married and becomes the mother of 3. And the most famous photo of Lemlich that's not up here is a photo of Lemlich in Moscow with Paul Robeson in the 50s. She was very feisty. I've spent the last month listening to tapes of her that she made in 1975 in a nursing home in LA, and she was organizing the workers there, much to the chagrin of her family.
Lillian Wald's relationship with her Jewishness was very complicated in that she never spoke Yiddish, she spoke German. The Henry Street settlement was open to all. However, her supporters were all German Jews, the 1%ers from uptown, Jacob Schiff, the Loebs, the Warburgs, and the dining room at Henry Street settlement, which you can see, you can visit the settlement and see the famous dining room, is where she frequently held dinners for her uptown supporters. Jacob Schiff came one day at the end of December and found a Christmas tree at the front door of the settlement and chided her, did not complain, but said, "What is this doing here?" And she stood up for her principles that Henry Street Settlement is open to everyone. Felix Warburg once commented, "You better watch out when you go to dinner at the settlement because you have to bring your checkbook." And Lillian Wald is going to talk you into a very big contribution. So she walked a fine line. She was never on a picket line because her fine line was she had to keep her supporters happy. They were the ones who were financing Henry Street Settlement. So she worked behind the scenes mainly. She had relationships with several presidents. Jacob Riis brought Theodore Roosevelt down to Henry Street Settlement. Lillian Wald could pick up the phone and speak to President Roosevelt, jump on a train and see him the next day in Washington. She had those kind of relationships with extraordinarily powerful people that allowed her to move on several fronts.
Kate, can you tell us about the Heterodox Club?
Sure. So, and I can also just address the question you asked. I don't know much about it. I know that, I would say that from my reading of Rose Pastor Stokes, certainly the religion she identified with would be socialism, that it sort of was the overriding thing. If it became, if it was an issue of feminism versus socialism, at least in the way she presented it, she would always present socialism as the overriding force. But I certainly see, certain aspects of Jewish identity in her activism. I mean, that's my own view of it. I don't know how she saw it exactly. It's not something I've seen a lot written about, actually. So, the Heterodoxy Club was a women's only group, a secret group on the Lower East Side that she was a member of. I believe a founding member, but maybe not. It didn't last for very long. I think it started in the 1910s and it was over by 1940. And this was a group for women who were considered creative people, although it wasn't necessarily, I think there was an effort for it to not be super classist, but it tended to be women who were able to be creators in their lives, which probably had some class implications. And it wasn't a particularly feminist group per se. It was a group of women talking about women's issues, but not on any particular platform. There were women speakers that would come, Helen Keller and Emma Goldman, and they kept this secret because they thought that they didn't want to be watched, basically. There were too many radicals among them. And so I think every other Saturday they would meet at various places, including Polly's, I forget which street it's on. Yeah, Polly's Cafe on McDougal Street, yeah. And it just sounds like a very cool thing. And not only that, but it was also, there were other similar groups. It was another luncheon club, I believe, but it didn't allow women who weren't white. And this group was different in that there was one African-American woman who was a member of the group. And also, I've read that I guess there were somewhere in the area of 100 members, and that about a fifth of them were either openly gay or bisexual. And that was not very common at that time.
I'd just like to add, when you were talking about interracial, when a group that became the NAACP, they were originally called themselves the Negro League. It was an interracial group. 1909, meeting in New York City, could not find a restaurant where an interracial group could sit down for dinner. And Lillian Wald opened up the settlement for this group.
Thank you. Please.
I'm just wondering whether the visiting nurses assisted with women who wanted abortions, and whether, I'm just wondering if they were Jewish, maybe they could get that service that they couldn't get from perhaps the Irish Catholic nurses.
It was very interesting, the question, did everybody hear the question? Whether the visiting nurses assisted in abortions. The visiting nurses assisted women who had botched abortions and were dying or.
That's the first story you sounded like that.
Right, that they were in and out of these homes. But there's no evidence at all that they assisted in abortions. Upper class, middle class women could talk to private doctors and find out whatever was available in terms of contraception. But if a woman, Sadie, goes to her doctor on the Lower East Side and asks for contraceptive advice, he said, this doctor tells her, tell your husband to sleep on the roof. That was because they were, the very poor had no access. That's why Margaret Sanger, who worked at Henry Street Settlement for a while as a nurse, that's where she came in. And Margaret Sanger did a very brilliant thing. She married a rich guy who helped to keep her out of jail. And she started the first birth control clinic in Brooklyn, but not through Henry Street, not through the nurses' settlement.
And birth control was illegal.
Yes,
Right, the Comstock Act?
yes.
It's part of the reason that Emma Goldman got arrested. She was extremely explicit about where you could buy things and how they worked.
Willie did that. Yes, please.
Do you have any knowledge of Lillian Wall's relationship with Paul Kellogg, who was the founder of Survey Graphics?
That is an excellent question, and I know the name, but I can't give you information. Maybe you can tell us more
Well, no,
about
I
it.
just know the Kellogg family,
Oh,
and I understand that they were together a very, very long time. I don't think she ever married. But I think
she never married. Lillian Wald was a lesbian. We have copies of letters that she wrote to several significant women in her life. And Henry Street Settlement, the nurses' settlement, was a place for unmarried women, mainly unmarried women lived there. So I'm not saying that everybody who lived there was a lesbian, but she definitely was.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
She also had children.
Oh, it's Susan LaRosa. Please raise your hand. If you have any questions about Henry Street Settlement.
Ask Joyce.
No. Susan LaRosa is the Director of Communications, PR, and so forth at Henry Street.
I was just gonna say, wasn't Helen Hall's husband Kellogg?
Was that it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, Helen Hall was a social worker who took over Henry Street Settlement after Lillian became ill. And I believe she was married to Paul Kellogg.
No.
I just might be gossiping.
I think you're right. I remember reading
I'm
that.
the first Kellogg lady, first wife.
Paul, did you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question about, I guess for Joyce or for you, I guess. So, we talked a little bit about how in the Henry Street Settlement, it was the antecedent to the NAACP, that it provided them space, the Negro League. But can you go more into depth about that? So besides providing a space, what did the Henry Street Settlement do to facilitate that or in terms of eventually becoming the NAACP? And then the other part of my question is, I'd like to understand a little bit more about any controversial or conflict that Lillian faced in her life, because I read a lot about a lot of the great accomplishments and a lot of what we talked about, but some of it I'm sure was extremely difficult. We talked about Emma Goldman, we talked about being part of these very controversial organizations. So how did she deal with that kind of pushback?
Okay, so let me answer the second question first before I forget what that's all about. Lillian Wall worked with system. Lillian Wald was a brilliant analyzer of what could be done and how it could be done. And so she was able to push all kinds of different, to jumpstart different organizations. However, not the NAACP. She was, as far as I know, she had very little contact. Well, no, wait. Louis Latimer, who was an African-American inventor in the electrical field, was a volunteer, found his way down to Henry Street Settlement and became a volunteer teaching English to new immigrants. So that was a connection that she had. But there's not much that I've seen with issues of interracial issues. There's a very small population of African Americans living on the Lower East Side. Actually, there's a church right across the street, St. Augustine's, am I correct, Susan?
Yes.
St. Augustine's Church, which is an African American church. And Lillian Wald, there were singers from the church who were trained at the music school of Henry Street Settlement. One of the things that the settlement did, Lillian Wald was very much involved in not just the health of people on the Lower East Side, but she felt that it was important to bring art, music, dance into their lives. And the uptown Lewison sisters from a very wealthy family came down as volunteers to lead clubs, music, art, dance clubs, and they financed what became the Playhouse, the neighborhood Playhouse, which just celebrated its 100th anniversary. So it was 1915, the neighborhood Playhouse, which is still functioning and now doing immensely fabulous productions, mostly extraordinarily avant-garde productions.
Yes, very provocative.
Very provocative. Right.
I'd like to add to that something about Lillian Wald and Rose Pastor Stokes, Clara Lemach, and Emma Goldman that they all had in common. They all got into a lot of trouble about World War I, and that includes Lillian Wald. While she was not on the picket lines and while she was not arrested, her views of World War I and her relationship, intellectual, with Bertrand Russell and his opposition to the war were very well known. It affected the settlement house. It affected a lot of her relationships with her donors, and it affected her overall, basically the way she was treated by historians until fairly recently. All these people, for very principled reasons, opposed the U.S. entry into World War I and did not realize they were going to be minoritarians, since Woodrow Wilson had initially been elected on an anti-war platform.
Well, I'm going to step in to say that unfortunately that's all the time we have for tonight. These ladies have generously supplied a list of additional reading material that's in tonight's handout, tonight's program. So go to the library and go to the bookstore, support your local bookstore, buy some books, read more about these women. I think it's pretty clear that the tradition of fiery ladies on the Lower East Side continues to this